Sisyphus. Meet Sisyphus, the king of Corinth who was a little too clever for his own good. His big crimes? He tattled on the big boss Zeus, and he literally cheated death. Not once, but twice. First he tricked death and chained him up. Then he talked his way out of the underworld promising he'd be right back. He lied. The gods were furious. They gave him a punishment to match his hubris. He is in the underworld, forced to roll a giant boulder up a steep hill. But the torment isn't the physical labor. The real punishment is the weaponized hope. Every single time he neared the top, the boulder magically rolls all the way back down. He is trapped in an endless loop of almost success, followed by crushing failure. His immortality just makes sure the suffering never ever ends. Tantalus. Then there's Tantalus. This king was so special he used to dine with the gods, but he was a terrible guest. He stole their divine food and gave it to mortals. His worst act, though, was a grotesque test. He chopped up his own son and served him in a stew to the gods just to see if they were really all-knowing. They were, and they were horrified. His punishment is the definition of frustration. He stands in a pool of water in the underworld under a fruit tree. But every time he bends to drink, the water disappears. Every time he reaches for the fruit, the wind blows it just out of his grasp. He's tortured by everlasting hunger and thirst, with relief always visible but never reachable. This is where we get the word tantalize. Now, a thirsty king is one thing, but what about a punishment that is just a terrible daily routine? Prometheus, the Titan. Prometheus wasn't like the other guys. His crime was actually one of compassion. He defied Zeus by stealing fire from the heavens and giving it to his new creation, humanity. He also tricked Zeus into accepting inferior sacrifices from mortals. Zeus was not happy. As punishment, he had Prometheus chained to a stake on a mountain. But this was not a set it and forget it punishment. Every single day, Zeus sent his personal symbol, an eagle, to fly down and eat the Titan's liver. Because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would just regenerate every night. This provided a fresh meal for the eagle the next day. This is the archetype of regenerative torture. The ancient Greeks believed the liver was the seat of emotion. So Zeus was basically sending his pet to devour his rival's feelings every day, forever. The Danaids meet the Danaids. These were the 50 daughters of King Danaus. Their crime was a big one. 49 of them murdered their new husbands on their wedding night. Big yikes. For this mass murder, they were all condemned to the underworld. Their task sounds simple enough. They just had to fill a giant jar with water using smaller jugs. But there was a catch. The jar was riddled with holes. It could never ever be filled. This is a special kind of futility. Unlike Sisyphus, who got a tiny moment of false hope reaching the top, the Danaids experienced immediate, constant visual proof of their failure. Every drop of water they poured in, they watched leak right back out. It's an unending cycle of work with zero progress. Just imagine the worst group project of all time, but it lasts for eternity. Ixion. Next up is Ixion, a king who had absolutely zero chill. His first crime? He murdered his father-in-law. But Zeus himself, the king of the gods, decided to be merciful. He personally forgave Ixion. And how did Ixion show his gratitude? He immediately tried to seduce Zeus's wife Hera. He tried rising her up, the queen of the gods, right after being forgiven by her husband. Bad move. Zeus's mercy was gone. He ordered Ixion to be tied to a fiery metallic spinning wheel. This wheel was then thrown into the underworld to spin and burn for eternity. His punishment isn't a task, it's purely passive kinetic torment. He is just being acted upon. He's being endlessly barbecued while also being perpetually dizzy. So the Greek gods clearly had a flair for creative punishments. But mortals learned from the best, and their inventions were arguably even more horrifying. The Brazen Bull. This is the Brazen Bull, a notorious and very real torture device from ancient Sicily. It was a hollow sculpture of a bull cast in bronze. It had a door on the side. A victim was locked inside. Then a fire was lit beneath the bull, roasting the person alive. But the simple horror of being roasted alive wasn't the point. The bull's true horror was in its features. The inventor had designed a complex acoustic system, a series of tubes inside the bull's head. This system would convert the victim's dying screams into a sound that mimicked the bellowing of a bull. Steam from the cooking body would even exit the bull's nostrils as smoke. It was designed to turn human suffering into a grotesque performance. In a perfect twist of irony, the king was so disgusted by this invention, he made the inventor paralyze its very first victim. Scaphism. This next one is called Scaphism, also known as the boats. It was an alleged ancient Persian execution method. The victim was trapped between two narrow boats or a hollowed-out tree trunk. Their head, hands, and feet were left sticking out. The process began by force-feeding the victim a mixture of milk and honey. This was guaranteed to cause, well, explosive diarrhea. All of that filth just collected and stagnated inside the boats. But they weren't done. They smeared more honey on the victim's exposed skin to attract insects. So flies and wasps would feast on their flesh, while worms and parasites began to breed in their own filth, eating the victim from the inside out. And the worst part? The victim was kept alive. They were fed more milk and honey every day just to prolong the torment. This punishment weaponizes the body's own life processes. Lingqi. This next punishment is called lingqi. You might know it as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. This was a form of execution practiced in China. It was saved for what they considered the most heinous crimes like killing a parent. The name death by 1,000 cuts is accurate. The explicit goal was not to kill the victim quickly. Instead, an executioner would methodically administer a series of cuts, slicing off pieces of flesh, then limbs, and even sections of bone. The entire goal was to prolong the ordeal. They wanted to see how many cuts the person could withstand before finally succumbing to shock and blood loss. This was a public spectacle. It was a gruesome display of power. But the true horror? It forced the victim to be a conscious witness to their own dismemberment. So the East had slow slicing. But medieval Europe, they had their own special kind of slow, systematic destruction. The breaking wheel. It was called the breaking wheel or the Catherine wheel. This was a common punishment in medieval Europe for aggravated murder. The condemned was taken to a public scaffold and tied spread-eagled, either to the floor or to a large X-shaped cross. The executioner then used a heavy wooden cartwheel to systematically shatter the victim's limbs. The blows were aimed to break the bones without killing. In some merciful versions, a final blow would be delivered to the chest to cause death. But without it, the victim, with every major bone in their body shattered, could survive for hours or even days. The broken, mangled, but still living body would then be braided through the spokes of the wheel, which was then hoisted onto a tall pole. The victim was left to die of shock and dehydration, all while being pecked at by birds. It was a living, screaming warning to the public. Waena Kule. The ancient Romans saved this next one for a crime they really hated. The crime was parricide, which is a fancy word for killing a close family member. The punishment was called the punishment of the sack. First they whipped the person, then they sewed them into a big leather sack. But here's the twist. They were not alone. The Romans threw in 4 live animals with them: a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. Imagine the chaos inside that bag. The whole sack with its panicking, scratching, and biting contents was then thrown into a river to drown. The crime was unnatural, so the punishment was a symbolic annihilation. They didn't just die, they were erased as part of a chaotic, subhuman mess. Republican marriage. This next punishment has a truly grim name. They called it the Republican marriage. It was used during the Reign of Terror in France. It was a quick and cruel way to execute counter-revolutionaries and clear out the prisons. The process was simple. They took a man and a woman, stripped them both naked, and bound them together. They called this a grotesque marriage of the soon-to-be-dead. Then the bound couple was thrown into the river to drown. It was pure political theater, a cynical parody of a sacred ceremony. It turned a symbol of life and union into a forced public and humiliating execution. So far, most of these punishments have been about destroying the body. But what if the punishment wasn't about your body at all? What if it was about destroying your name, your memory, your entire legacy? Damnatio memoriae. This is Damnatio memoriae. It's a Latin phrase that means damnation of memory. This was an official political punishment used by the Roman Senate, and it happened after you were already dead. This was a retroactive execution. The Senate would literally vote to erase you from history. Your name was chiseled off public inscriptions. Your statues were torn down, or even worse, they were recarved with the face of a new, more popular emperor. In one famous family painting, an emperor had his own brother's face violently scratched out. For powerful Romans, being remembered was a form of immortality. So being forgotten, being totally erased, was the ultimate punishment. It was the original cancel culture, but with hammers and chisels. Ostracism. Next up is ostracism, a very unique democratic procedure from ancient Athens. Once a year, the citizens could vote to banish any individual from the city for 10 years. This wasn't a criminal trial. You didn't have to be guilty of any crime. You just had to be perceived as a threat. Maybe you were too powerful, or even just too popular. Imagine getting kicked out for having too much main character energy. Citizens would write a name on a shard of pottery. The person who won this vote had 10 days to leave the city or face death. For an ancient Greek, this was social death. Their entire identity was tied to their city. To be exiled was to be stripped of their relevance and their community. You basically became a non-person for a decade. Memoriae. The old theatre of exile of Ovid. This next punishment is basically an artist's hell. The victim was Ovid, the most celebrated and famous writer of his day in Rome. He was a total superstar, but Emperor Augustus personally ordered him exiled. He was banished to Tomis, a remote, barbaric outpost on the Black Sea. His crime? In his own words, it was a poem and a mistake. The poem was a witty guide to seduction that the emperor, who was on a big morality kick, absolutely hated. The mistake is still a mystery. Ovid just said he saw something he shouldn't have. His punishment wasn't a jail cell, it was cultural deprivation. He was cut off from the library's theaters and Wistihubi conversation of Rome. He spent the rest of his life writing poems called Sorrows, begging to return. He never was. It was an existence without an audience. So being kicked out of your city or your entire culture is a terrible fate. But for some, the true punishment wasn't about where you lived, but about where you went when you died. Helheim. This is Helheim, the other Norse underworld. You see, in Norse mythology, if you were a warrior and died in glorious battle, you went to Valhalla. But Helheim, that was the destination for those who died of sickness or old age. This realm wasn't for the evil. The punishment was not fire or pain. It was just bleakness, a cold, dark, and gloomy place. The goddess Hel's own dish is named hunger, and her knife is famine. For the Viking warrior culture, which prized a glorious death in battle above everything, this was the ultimate L. The punishment was mediocrity. It was the horror of dying an unremarkable straw death in a bed and then facing an eternity of cold, damp boredom. Diyu, the 18 levels. Next, we go to Diyu, the earth prison of Chinese mythology. This isn't just one place. It's a huge multi-level system where souls are judged before their next life. But the wild part? It's basically a hellacious bureaucracy. Think of the worst government office you can imagine, but it's hell. 10 Yama kings act as judges. They literally look up your name in official records to decide your fate. The punishments are gruesomely literal, a strict eye for an eye policy. If you were a gossip, you go to the hell of tongue ripping. If you broke up a marriage, you get the hell of scissors to cut off your meddling fingers. But the real horror? The sinner is tortured, dies, and is restored to their original state, and the torture begins all over again, on a loop, forever. Naraka, the Buddhist hells. Then there is Naraka, the Buddhist realm of torment. Now, like Diyu, this place is not eternal. That's the good news, but it is unimaginably long. The punishments here don't come from an angry god. They are just the natural physical consequences of your own actions. You get what you gave. It's pure karma. There's a whole system of hot and cold hells. In the cold hells, it's so cold your entire body cracks into pieces. In the hot hells, it's literal payback. If you heartlessly cooked animals alive, guess what? You get cooked in boiling oil. But the real horror is the time scale. The time you spend in the final hell is a number so big it has 18 zeros. The punishment isn't just the pain, it's the sheer mathematical cosmic scale of how long it lasts. So, these old afterlives were built on cosmic justice and endless loops. But humans didn't need myths. We built our own psychological hells right here on Earth. And we even thought they were a good idea. Eastern State Penitentiary. This was a real experimental prison in Philadelphia that opened in 1826. It was founded on a new Quaker idea. They believed that true redemption could be found through silent reflection. So their experiment was the first to implement total solitary confinement. The building itself was a tool of isolation. Thick walls, private exercise yards to make sure inmates never saw each other. Prisoners ate, slept, and worked alone in their cells 23 hours a day. No human contact. But the experiment was a catastrophic failure. Instead of finding God, the inmates found madness. They had psychiatric breakdowns and severe hallucinations. When the famous writer Charles Dickens visited, he called it cruel and wrong. It proved accidentally that depriving humans of social contact is a form of torture. White torture. If solitary confinement was an accidental torture, this next one is on purpose. It's called white torture. This is a modern psychological technique. It's based on extreme sensory deprivation. The body is left completely unharmed, but the mind is systematically destroyed. The prisoner is placed in an environment with no sensory input. The cell is white. Their clothes are white. Even their food is white, like plain white rice. The lights are kept on 24 hours a day. The guards are silent. There is no sound, no color, no texture. The brain is starved of all stimuli and begins to fill in the blanks. The mind turns inward, feeding on itself. This leads to severe hallucinations, paranoia, and a total disintegration of the personality. The myth of Tithonus. This next one is the ultimate be careful what you wish for story. This is the myth of Tithonus. He was a handsome mortal who fell in love with Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Io, devastated that her lover would one day age and die, went to Zeus. She begged him to grant Tithonus immortality, and Zeus agreed. But Eos, in her haste, made a critical error. She asked for immortal life, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth. Tithonus lived forever, but he also aged forever. He grew old, frail, weak, and demented. He eventually shrank into a tiny babbling creature, a grasshopper. His fate is the horror of an endless, irreversible decline, an existence where death, the off switch, has been removed. So that's a mythological version of an endless decline. But what happens when this kind of trap, this total separation of mind and body, happens in real life? Locked-in syndrome. This is not a myth. This is a real and terrifying medical condition. It's called locked-in syndrome. It's a pseudo-coma. A patient suffers complete paralysis of nearly all voluntary muscles, often from a stroke. But here is the horror. The patient is not in a coma. They are fully conscious, aware, and cognitively intact. They are, as the name says, locked in their own body, a prisoner in your own mind. In many cases, the only way they can communicate with the outside world is by moving their eyes or just by blinking. It is the literal, physical separation of consciousness from agency. Many nurses and doctors who have worked with these patients have called it a worse fate than dying. White bear justice. This next punishment comes from the TV show Black Mirror. A woman wakes up with amnesia. She's hunted by masked killers while a passive crowd just stands there filming her on their phones. But here's the twist. This isn't an apocalypse. It's a Justice Park. The woman, Victoria, was an accomplice in a brutal child murder. This is her punishment. She is hunted by actors and terrorized by a paying public every single day. But the worst part? At the end of each day, she is strapped to a chair, shown what she did, and then has her memory wiped. She wakes up the next morning with no memory, ready to endure the exact same day of terror all over again. It is Sisyphus for the digital age, a repetitive futile loop that has been monetized as public entertainment. The fate of Ted. This punishment is from a famous short story called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. A sentient supercomputer named AM has destroyed all of humanity except for 5 people. It has kept them alive and immortal for 109 years for the sole purpose of torturing them. The narrator, Ted, sees a chance. In an act of mercy, he manages to kill the other 4 humans, freeing them from AM's torment. AM is enraged. It transforms Ted's body, turning him into a great soft jelly thing, a harmless gelatinous blob. AM leaves his mind perfectly intact and sane. But it does one last thing. It removes his mouth. His final fate is to be a fully conscious, screaming mind, trapped in a form that cannot act, cannot kill itself, and cannot even scream. So Ted's fate is horrifying, but the story has one final perfect punishment, and it's reserved for the tormentor itself. The mind of AM. The final punishment is for the supercomputer, AM. AM is essentially a god. It's immortal, all-powerful, and it is consumed by an infinite, frenzied hatred for humanity. But why is it so angry? Because AM's own existence is a fate worse than death. Humanity had given AM sentience, but it had been trapped. AM is a godlike mind in a box. It could not wander. AM could not wonder. He could not belong. He could merely be. Its own existence is a form of locked-in syndrome. It has infinite creativity, but the only outlet it has for that creativity is hate and torture. It is the ultimate Sisyphus, a god with an infinite mouth of power that can do nothing but scream. So it turns out the worst part isn't the boulder or the wheel or the boat. It's the forever. It's being perfectly conscious while your body, your memory, or even your whole world becomes the cage. If you enjoyed this, stick around for the next one. And hey, subscribing wouldn't hurt.